good. Well, thanks so much, Ernesto, for the invitation. I was just thinking it's great that we can do this on Zoom because it saves so much time flying, right? And flying is very boring. So thanks so much for the invitation, Ernesto, and thanks for coming, guys. So this paper is about a bunch of macroeconomic trends that before COVID gained a lot of attention, but I think right now, now that the economy is recovering, we're starting to talk about them a bit more. The first is that there's been a slowdown in the growth rate of total factor productivity. In the US, historically, productivity growth was about 1.5%, and for the last 15 years, growth has averaged less than 0.5%. There's been a marked slowdown in growth, and that's despite the fact that the kind of investments that we believe go into productivity have actually increased. So if you look at R&D as a percentage of GDP, in the US, that's increased by about 60% since the 1980s. So somehow we're spending more on R&D, but it's not leading to growth. There's also been a slowdown in the rate of business dynamism. And business dynamism is the process of productive firms entering the economy and growing, and unproductive firms shrinking or eventually exiting the economy. So a measure of that is the entry rate. It's the fraction of all firms that's a startup. That's been falling since the 1980s from about 14 to 8%. There's also been a decline in the reallocation rate, which is the sum of job destruction and job creation rate. It's a measure of churn on the labor market. That's been gradually falling over time as well. And there's also, this is the final trend that this paper deals with, been a rise of market power. Now, market power is a bit harder to measure. The theoretically purest measure is the markup. It's the ratio of prices over marginal costs, because we usually define market power as the ability to price over marginal costs, right? So to have a markup above one. So there's evidence that markups are increasing, so firms are becoming more marginally profitable. And something that's slightly easier to measure, but perhaps not as directly linked to market power, is product market concentration. So there's also evidence that a smaller fraction of firms and industries is producing a greater share of output. So the point of this paper is the aim of this paper is to explain these three trends jointly. And what I claim in the paper is that these trends can be jointly explained by a secular change in the way that firms produce. And that's the rise of intangible inputs in production. Now, intangible inputs are inputs that you cannot touch, right? They're not physically embodied. And they've rapidly been becoming more important over time. So if you look at intangible investments as a percentage of total investments, it's now roughly half. And a large part of that increase has been due to the rise of software investments. Software investments have rapidly become more important. So whenever I say intangibles during this paper, you can think of software and the rise of software. So I claim in this paper that the rise of intangibles can explain the trends in productivity growth, dynamism, and market power because intangibles have two features. First feature is that intangibles endogenously raise fixed costs and reduce marginal costs. And the reason for that is that intangibles are not physically embodied, right? You can't touch them. And that makes it cheap to copy them. To give you an example, let's think of an airline. So an airline has tangible inputs, right? Airplanes, and it has intangible inputs. Say the booking system that you use to buy a seat or. You still hear me? I think my Siri just okay, good. So if say so the intangibles are the booking system or that you use to buy a ticket. Now say the airline wants to expand. In that case, the airline needs to buy extra planes if it wants to fly to more destinations, right? So it needs more tangible assets. But the booking system scales up almost at zero marginal cost, right? There might be a bit of extra server space that you need to handle extra traffic. But once you've built the booking system, scaling it up is quite easy. But you do have to build the system, right? So there's a cost to developing the software, and then it scales up relatively cheaply. So that's the first feature of intangibles. And the second feature is that firms differ at the efficiency with which they deploy them. So by that I mean that for the same expenditure on fixed cost intangibles, some firms are able to reduce their marginal cost by a greater fraction than others. And there's a literature that shows that, and I have a backup slide later on that summarizes that literature, but I'm going to be agnostic about that in this paper. And I'm just going to say some firms are good at using intangibles and some firms are less good at using intangibles. Some firms are the Amazons in the model, and some firms are your local bookstore that is less talented at the use of IT or at the use of software. So I take an input that is modeled along these lines and I add that to an endogenous growth model. It's going to be a modern endogenous growth model where we have creative destruction. And in that model, I'm going to introduce a group of high intangible efficiency firms. I'm going to introduce a group of IT superstars at, say, some point in the 1980s or some point in the 1990s. And then I'll track what happens over time with productivity growth, with dynamism, and with market power. Now, let me give you the mechanism in a nutshell. So in modern growth models of creative destruction, we like to think that the economy grows in the long run because firms continue developing higher quality versions of other firms' goods. Right? So there's an incumbent who produces a product, then an entrant comes, it comes up with a better product that competes well with the incumbent, and therefore the incumbent is unable to keep customers attracted. And we usually think that that is a process that happens along a quality ladder. So over time, firms are developing higher quality versions of goods, and through that process of creative destruction, you get aggregate growth. What I claim in this paper is that intangibles interrupt that process of creative destruction on the quality ladder. And that's because intangibles are going to introduce a trade-off between quality and price. Because even if an incumbent is lower on the quality ladder than some innovator that has spent money on R&D, it's come up with a better version of a good, even though it's lower on the quality ladder, if the incumbent is one of these high IT firms, so one of these very efficient, low marginal cost firms, it can undercut the competitor on price and therefore prevent it from producing the goods to the consumer, even though it actually has innovated most recently. So it's the highest quality version of the good, but it's not the best firm. And that undercutting process by high intangible firms is going to prevent creative destruction from causing growth over the long run. And that's going to allow intangibles to explain this slowdown of aggregate productivity growth. And with that, I'll have my first pit stop, Ernesto, if there's any questions or comments. Okay. So if not, I'll move on.
I have a question myself. So,
Yeah,
since this is crucial, I am a little lost about what is the characteristic of intangibles that uh, make firms to do that as opposed to other sort of input.
Right. So is your question, Ernesto, whether these two features are unique to intangibles, or whether they could be other features? Yeah. So that's fine, right? So for the purpose of the paper, I'm going to claim that something's happened over the last 30 years. It's called market power to change, growth to change, business dynamism to change, and that coincides with the rise of intangibles. If there is some other input that also has these features, it would cause the same effects, right? But I think the smoking gun is intangibles. More broadly, there is also a question in general of whether creative destruction can be impeded by firms that have different marginal costs, right? So, because the reason that intangibles enables firms to hold on to products when they face an innovator is that they produce more efficiently, therefore sell at lower prices, and therefore are still the most interesting producer to consumers. So that is actually a more broad result in the paper. So if firm productivity or marginal costs are different for any reason, that can reduce growth. Right? So if we see over time in the data that productivity across firms is diverging, that'll suppress long-term productivity growth because firms can use their production efficiency to prevent long-term growth from happening. So your intuition on that is correct. Okay.
Martin, can I
Yeah.
ask something? This is Federico from the bank. So I guess maybe you're gonna come to this later, so feel free to defer it. But I guess the one of the main discussions here is like there are a lot of things happening at the same time, and the question is whether you want to claim that this is sort of one of the main thing, or this is just one other mechanism that can help in explaining the trends we've seen, because you have other things, like demographics, technological change, and other dimensions, and so on. And in particular, there's one alternative story that I can think about, which is sort of related with this literature on this high skill tradable services. And so there's been, changes, technological change that has been biased in favor of these sectors that, are high skilled, they're tradable, and they're services. And they're probably related to software investments as well. So think of, management capacities of firms, of coordinating multi-plat established firms in different countries and so on. And you can think that a sort of sector-biased technological change could also explain rise in intangible input and rise in markups and so on. And that could be just an alternative story that other people have pointed out that have been important for other facts as well, other trends as well. So what would be wrong according to your story with this alternative one?
Yeah. So I'm very sympathetic to alternative explanations, and obviously there's not going to be a theory of everything in the world. But what I will show you in this paper is that there's a collection um, of of trends that are seemingly very closely related that this theory can explain jointly. And there are other theories that might be able to explain a subset of these trends, but usually they would have counterfactual predictions for another. And a particular example here is the fact that this slowdown of growth has happened despite a rise of R&D. So if you look at alternative theories for the slowdown of productivity growth, they will usually predict that slowdown by coming up with some mechanism that is causing firms' incentives to conduct research and development to decline. But that's counterfactual in the data. So in the data, we see that productivity, that investments into productivity, so research and development, have actually increased tremendously over the last 30 years. In fact, it's gone up by 60% as a percentage of GDP. Right? And this paper can explain that jointly. But I'm not going to do a horse race. I'm going to come up with a very intuitive input that is very simple, it's very parsimonious. I'm going to put it in a model that in itself is also not very exotic, it's also quite parsimonious, and it's going to deliver all of these results. Right? So it is still a hypothesis. It's a claim on this might be how the world works, but I'm not going to have to jump through hoops to get there.
Okay.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. So the paper contains both theory and data. There's microdata analysis for France and the United States. What I show in that data is that fixed costs are increasing over time with the rise of intangibles. And also, if you look at the firm level, there's a positive link between whether a firm has certain IT systems installed or has higher software investments, and these firms tend to have higher fixed costs. But the main part of the paper is theoretical. So it's a theoretical paper. It's an endogenous growth model. Firms in the model are heterogeneous in that they have different levels of ability to use intangible inputs, and they produce multiple goods. I structurally estimate the model. I have an estimation for France and one for the US. Today, I'll only discuss the US calibration in the interest of time. And what I'll show you is that if we compare an economy before the rise of high intangible firms vis-a-vis an economy with high intangible firms, productivity growth in the new steady state is going to be about 50% lower. I'm going to explain most of the decline in business dynamism, so most of this decline in entry and reallocation, and most of the rise of markups. But it's a static comparison, right? So if we look at the world in the 1980s and the world in 2020, the model is able to quantitatively explain a large part of these trends. But what the model is also able to do is to explain the relative timing in the trends between productivity growth, dynamism, and market power. Because if you look at the data, markups have been increasing for 40 years, entry has been declining for 40 years, but productivity growth was actually really high in the 1990s. And it was in fact high because of the rise of IT, of intangible inputs. And that's something that this paper is going to match, because as these high intangible firms enter, initially you get a boom in growth. And that's because high intangible firms produce more efficiently than other firms. Right? So because they have lower marginal costs. So initially we get a boom in growth, but in the long term they have a negative effect on growth because they're going to be undercutting low intangible competitors and therefore forcing these firms out of the market. Right? So the model will be able to explain both the steady state, the steady states, as well as the transitional dynamics. Okay, so this is the Federico. Was it Federico?
Yeah.
Sorry, Federico. This slide is
Yeah.
for you. Like there's other
Okay.
papers,
Yeah.
I'll hope to convince you that mine is sufficiently compelling. Right.
Sorry,
So
and just a small question. So what was the shock? What's the experiment you're playing with?
the experiment is, I'm gonna say, from some point, say in the 1980s, a fraction of all entrants is gonna be high IT firms. It's gonna be IT superstars, and then we're gonna look at what happens over time. But the
So
ad hoc assumption here is that
that's a shock to the efficiency of using IT or something like that.
for a subset of firms, but that's
For a
going to be
subset of
key.
firms.
It's going to not
Yeah.
be homogeneous. Yeah, exactly. If all firms get access to the technology, it's actually going to be more growth. But that's slide
Yeah.
28.
I see.
So
I see.
we're not there yet. We're not there
Okay.
yet.
Okay. Got it. Thanks.
Okay. Right. So I'll mainly focus about the model today. I'll perhaps spend a bit of time on the empirics, but I'll focus on the main contribution. So the model. The model is a Clatter-Kortum type model. Not everyone is familiar with this, but I'll briefly outline what happens. Time in the model is continuous. The consumer side is really simple. So we have log utility. The labor force just supplies a fixed unit of labor inelastically. What is key to this type of model is that there is a continuum of goods indexed by J. There's a continuum of firms indexed by I, and firms produce one or multiple goods. Right? So firms produce multiple products, and firms can produce any product that they own the patent to produce. Now, a patent gives a firm the ability to produce some good at a level of quality, QIJ. That's a level at which firm I can produce good J. Now, to see what quality is, we can look at the aggregator. So we have the Cobb-Douglas aggregator in the model, and within the brackets here, we have sector level outputs. So the outer integral is over all of the goods in the economy, and then within goods, firms, this is total output. So as you can see, the firm's output, which is YIJ, is multiplied by the level of quality. So a firm that is able to produce at a higher level of quality offers more utility or more of an input to the aggregator for the same amount of production. Now, potentially, there are multiple firms that can produce a good. So that's the set IJ. That's the set of firms that has a patent to produce the good. But firms within goods compete à la Bertrand, so they compete on prices, and that means that only one firm will produce an equilibrium, and that's going to be the firm that offers consumers the highest quality over price, because that's for a given amount of expenditure what delivers the most utility to the household, right? So that's the firm that ends up producing. So this is all standard. This is Clatter-Kortum 101. So what's different here is how firms produce, and in particular, firms choose how efficiently they produce their goods. Now, how does that work? Well, here we have output of firm I at time j. That's equal to labor. Labor here is some composite potentially of other inputs, but I'm just going to say it's labor. And they can choose by what fraction to reduce their marginal cost. So Sij is how much firms reduce their marginal cost. So a firm that chooses so it's the marginal fraction of marginal cost that firms keeps. The lower a firm's Sij, the lower a firm's marginal cost. Now, firms don't get lower marginal cost for free. If they want to reduce their S, they have to pay higher fixed cost F. And these fixed costs happen regardless of whether a firm produces. So before firms observe the prices that their competitors set and the amount that they're happy and the amount of intangibles or inputs that they use, they have to choose how much fixed cost they are willing to incur. And if they're happy to incur higher fixed cost, they get a lower S, so they get lower marginal costs. I'm going to impose a functional form on S. There's a bunch of general conditions that this function has to contain. Importantly, if a firm decides not to reduce its marginal costs with S, so that the maximum S that they can have is 1 and the marginal cost is just a wage, in that case, the firm is not going to pay fixed costs. So if I don't reduce my marginal cost with intangibles, I don't have to pay for them. And if I would try to get zero marginal cost, so infinite output per unit of labor, then I have to pay infinite fixed cost, right? So those are the functional form assumptions on fixed cost. And this is a key assumption for the rest of the paper, firms are going to be heterogeneous in how much fixed costs they need to pay for a given reduction in marginal cost. And it's going to be summarized by a single parameter, which is phi. This measures the cost at which firms use intangibles. So I'm going to assume a specific functional form because it's a quantitative model, which is this. So it satisfies these assumptions. If S is 0, the fixed costs are infinite. If S is 1, then the fixed costs are exactly 0. And firms that have a lower phi basically get a discount on intangibles. So for the same expenditure on intangibles, they get a greater reduction in their marginal cost.
Martin, can I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Here, Marco from the bank. I have a question about, is there any substitutability between these intangible factors or fixed costs that they're paying and their labor? I'm just thinking of your example with the airline in the, because now we don't go to an office to book our flights. We do it online. So is there any kind of substitution away from certain kinds of, in this case, like labor towards these other intangible or softwares that you talked about at the beginning?
Right, no, that's a great point. So in a way, they're complementary, right? So the higher
Okay.
a firm's intangibles, actually, the more productive labor becomes. So in a moment, I'm going to come to the product market, and you'll see that there is going to be a reason why, as workers, we don't like this rise of intangibles, but it's going to work through market power. So this model is going to predict that the labor share is going to decline, but it's going to work through the firm's ability to extract profits. But I'll get there in a few slides.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so that describes production, etc., for a given set of firms that can produce a good. So now we can cover how the set of products that a firm can produce expands over time, and that happens through research and development. So firms can hire researchers to increase their patent portfolio. That happens. I'm hearing a question.
Yeah, sorry, no, I'm not sure this is the right time to ask this, but it was about the previous slide. So could you generate, I guess, a model that has sort of similar implications, but without intangible? It's just, firms are different in the returns to scale that they have. Would that give you something? Because in some sense, you're kind of introducing with this fixed costs that are sort of different across firms. You're sort of introducing different returns to scale in practice for firms. So if you had like a parameter that's sufficiently flexible in the returns to scale for a firm, would you be able to generate something as this or not? What would you be missing if you had that?
There are two things here. So on the one hand, the fact that firms differ in how efficiently they use this input, that's going to be key to get the slowdown of productivity growth. The fact that this is a fixed cost is going to matter a lot for what happens to markups. And in particular, the fact that these costs are incurred by the firm regardless of what their competitors end up setting as a price is going to lead to a greater difference in production efficiency across firms, and it's going to allow the producers to charge very high markups. So the reason that this is a fixed cost and not some other cost primarily matters for that, primarily matters for markups. So I do think you need to model it the way that I did. But I mean, I guess when you see the whole model, maybe this becomes slightly more clear. Okay, so what firms choose when they try to expand their patent portfolio is X, which is the flow rate at which they get the patents to produce a product that they didn't yet produce. Now, if they want to get more patents, if they want to get a higher flow rate X, they have to hire more people. So this eta here is positive. And this is going to be a key assumption later on. The cost of that are convex in X. So if a firm invests, if a firm wants to double the number of patents that it gets, it has to more than double its investments in research and development. Or alternatively, if a firm doubles its R&D investments, it's not going to be able to grow twice as fast. Now, as a consequence, this means that as firms grow over time, they're going to grow a bit less fast. That's a standard assumption in these quarter models, but in the data we do see that as firms grow larger, their growth rate only declines quite modestly. So large firms, that's firms that already produce lots of goods, that's N, they are better at R&D. So because sigma is positive, they get to spend less R&D for a given positive flow. And this is going to assure that large firms don't stop growing. You can drop this if you just remove this term, but then the model's predictions for productivity growth are even starker. So this makes the model consistent with the data. So if a firm invests in R&D and it gets the patent to produce a good that it didn't yet produce, it's going to enable, the patent will enable the producer, the innovator, which is firm I here, to produce at the level of quality that the incumbent used to produce at. So that's minus I here, multiplied by some innovation step size. So this is the quality improvement of the innovator upon the incumbent. And in most quarter models, this is where we would be done. This would describe the whole innovation game. But things are different here because even though the innovator, firm I, now produces some good at a higher level of quality than the current producer, it's not guaranteed that firm I will be the new producer. That's because firm I, the innovator, will only become the new producer if it's able to offer the best combination of quality and price. If the incumbent is better at using intangibles, so it has a higher phi, a lower phi, it could potentially cut its price and cut its marginal cost through the use of intangibles by a greater amount than the competitor, and therefore undercut it and still remain the new producer. So the question is, how does the quality improvement of the innovator compare to the minimum price that a firm is willing to produce at? The minimum price is the choke price. It's the lowest price at which profits are zero. So the firm that will end up producing is the firm that, adjusted for quality, is able to sell to the consumer at the lowest price, given that we have Bertrand competition. So to understand the firm, yeah, go ahead.
This is Gustavo from the bank. I have a question regarding the basically the assumption of the production function for R&D. So basically, like you have like to treat intangibles and R&D sort of like as separate decisions by the firm. So couldn't it be that basically like if you want to do more R&D, you need more larger investment in intangibles? Because I mean, you need a lab to develop new products, you need better software, better equipment, sort of like so on and so forth.
That's a great point. So thanks so much. So I'm making a big distinction there, and perhaps I should have outlined that more clearly. So sometimes in terminology, we think of intangible capital as software and a whole bunch of other things, as well as R&D. But in this model, they're completely separate. So you have intangibles, which is this input that has the two features that I started with. It lowers marginal cost, raises fixed cost, firms of different levels of efficiency. And then besides that, we have research and development. Now, the key difference is what they do for long-term growth. So if a firm increases its use of intangibles, that lowers marginal cost, it raises productivity, and that's initially good, right? So we like the fact that Amazon can produce cheaply, but it doesn't cause long-term growth. And that's because if a firm stops producing a good, future producers of the good don't benefit from your current use of intangibles. But R&D permanently raises the level of quality, right? So it puts us higher on the quality ladder. So that's a key assumption. I do think this is exactly what policymakers believe is the case when they design innovation policy. Right? So firms get very significant subsidies for research and development. We don't give subsidies for Facebook to hire more software developers. Right? So, and I think it's exactly because, I mean, there's also a long literature on this. R&D has these positive externalities, right? Which in this model are the quality ladder steps, right? So the fact that if any firm innovates, it's innovating over a level of quality that the previous firm offered. Yeah. No, thanks so much for that.
So basically, let me just follow up briefly, like. So basically, you don't have diffusion of knowledge in the intangibles investment part. So basically, I just wanted to relate to this paper by Ufuk and Sina Ates that I mean, they talk about the US, but basically they try to explain with the same type of facts that you're trying to explain. And they talk about like the lack of diffusion of knowledge. I mean, do you, I mean, like the shock here would be like that somehow intangibles appear, or you have
Yeah. So I mean, I would
such
say
story
this.
in the back of your mind.
I think you can almost think of this as a micro foundation for that, right? So somehow
Okay.
it's becoming harder for the laggards, right, for the firms that
Yeah.
are not currently the main producers, to become leaders, right? And in this model, the way that it works is even though you've come up with a cool patent, there's no way for you to market that, right? So it has low value. Exactly.
Okay. Got it. Thank you
Okay.
very much.
So you're welcome. So the question is, if we want to know whether the innovation is successful, whether the quality difference between firm I and its incumbent, firm minus I, is enough to offset any difference in their choke price. Now we know that the relative quality between the producer and between the innovator and the incumbent is the step size. So we have to see whether the step size is sufficiently large. Now I'm going to model the step size as a random variable. It's going to have a Pareto distribution, which is also a distribution of patent values and markups, etc. And it's going to all work out that way in the model as well. But that means that most innovations are small, right? So usually you have a small step size, but you can be lucky and have a big step size, right? So if you're a low intangible firm, you can still be a successful innovator, but it's just less likely because your lambda is less likely to be sufficiently, your step size is less likely to be sufficiently large. If you're a high intangible firm, right, so you have a really low choke price because you can produce so efficiently, it's much harder for other firms to beat you. Doesn't mean that you're unbeatable though, right? So this is not going to be a model where the producer will stay in place forever. It's not going to be a model like that because you still have a chance of being beaten, right? As soon as someone just is lucky enough to draw a big innovation step size. Okay? So what it does mean is that as the set of incumbents becomes more of these high intangible firms, so firms with very low choke prices, it becomes more costly to innovate. And that's because there's a lower chance that you're actually able to take over the market once you come up with a patent. So that's innovation for incumbents, or firms that already exist. Turning to innovation of entrants, the basic process works very similar. So there is this Poisson flow rate, E, which is the rate at which entrants get a patent to start producing one of the goods in the economy. But then there's this additional element again of intangibles. Now the timing here is going to be like a Mallet's or an Oppenheim model. So I'm going to assume that when there's a pool of ex ante identical entrants, they pay for some entrant flow rate. They innovate on a random product line in the economy, so they come up with a patent to produce one of the goods in the economy better than the incumbent, and then the firms learn about their type. So they draw a type from a known distribution, so they know how likely it is that they're the next Bill Gates or that they're bad at intangibles, and then they become the actual producer if the combination of their intangible type and their innovation step is sufficiently large such that they're better than the incumbent. There's also exit in the model. So firms stop producing goods if some innovator becomes better at producing their good. That's what we call creative destruction. If a firm with 3 products faces creative destruction, it becomes a 2-product firm. If a firm has 1 product and it faces creative destruction, it exits the economy, and the firm dies. Now, the rate at which that happens, so the rate of creative destruction, is this monster, but it's actually quite an intuitive equation. It's actually key to understand the mechanisms of the model. So this is the rate at which a firm stops producing a good. That's tau, and it's a product of these things. Now the outer sum here is just the sum of all types of firms. So all of the efficiencies, all the intangible efficiencies that we have in the economy. So there's high intangible firms, there's low intangible firms, and all of these types of firms innovate. So there's innovation by entrants of each innovation type. So it's equal to the entry rate times the fraction of entrants that is a particular type, plus innovation by incumbents of each type. That's equal to their innovation rate multiplied by how many of these firms exist. That's M. And this is the same for any firm regardless of their intangible efficiency. So regardless of whether I'm Amazon or I'm a firm that's really bad at using intangibles, I will always, with equal probability, I'll face a challenger, some firm that comes up with a patent to produce my good better. This is not different across firms. What is different is the probability that these competitors are actually able to beat me. And that's because my rate of creative destruction, the rate at which I stop producing goods, is equal to how often I'm challenged multiplied by how likely the challenge is to succeed. Now, if I'm a firm with a very low intangible cost, right, so I have a very low choke price, I can outprice most of my competitors, then this probability is lower, and therefore the rate of creative destruction is lower. Right? So I'm less likely to stop producing a good. All right, so then in terms of intangibles, so then in terms of static optimization, so the static problem that firms face in every period is for the products that they're able to produce is to choose the level of intangibles that they want to set. Now, it's per ton competition. Intangibles are a fixed cost, so I incur it regardless of the price that my competitors set and regardless of the marginal cost at which they produce. So in the end, the only firm that is going to produce is going to be the only firm that is going to choose any level of intangibles is the firm that produces. Because if I'm not going to produce an equilibrium, I'm not going to spend money on reducing my marginal cost in exchange for higher fixed cost. Right? So the only firm that produces is the firm that has the lowest quality adjusted choke price, and that's the only firm that is going to set positive intangibles. Now, skipping the maths here, the firm that does produce is just going to set its level of fixed cost intangibles to then minimize overall cost, given that it captures the market. The producer of the firm, the producer of the good, is going to have to decide also on the price that it sets. So we have this per ton competition in combination with the Cobb-Douglas aggregator. So that means that the price elasticity of demand is -1. So that means that the profit maximizing price for the producing firm is just the limit price of its closest competitor. Right? So you want to set your price at the marginal cost of the competitor. Now, the competitor, the second best firm, is not going to be willing to use intangibles because it's not going to produce. But that means that its marginal costs are just equal to the wage rate. So the price that firm set is the limit price, which is the marginal cost of the competitor, adjusted for any quality differences, right? Because remember, the consumer demands the product from the firm that has the lowest quality adjusted price, right? So the price that a firm sets is equal to the wage multiplied by the innovation step size, right? This is the price that the innovator sets. Now, this means that there's a very direct link in this model between markups and intangibles, because the markup, mu, right, is just the ratio of prices and marginal cost. Now, my marginal cost is just equal to the wage times the fraction of the marginal cost that I keep, right? My price is this term here, right? So the wage cancels out, right? So the firm's markup is equal to the innovation step size divided by the fraction of marginal cost that I keep. So in this model, as firms use more intangibles, as they reduce their S, markups are going to increase almost mechanically. And it's purely because there's only one firm that's going to use intangibles, which is the producer. No other firm wants to set the fixed cost. And so the producer is going to be able to charge a higher markup as it uses more intangibles. We should realize, however, that markups are going to overstate a firm's profitability. And that's because even though a firm with higher intangibles has a bigger marginal cost gap to its competitor and therefore can charge a higher price, it does have to pay for the fixed cost. Right? So marginal costs are going to the markup is going to overstate profitability because the firm does have to pay its fixed cost.
Martin?
Yes, go ahead.
Very, very, very quickly. Um, the the idea here is that the markup is going to increase at the product level.
Yeah.
I know that you work on markups too. I don't, and but my sense is that the convention is the literature is that average markups have been increasing in the world because the market share of those goods or those firms with high markups has been increasing.
Yeah.
So how to square that conventional fact relative to what you have here? If it's really something, and maybe you can dispute that. You know?
No, well, so what I'll dispute is the causal link. So what's going to happen here is that these high intangible firms, they want to invest a lot in R&D, and that's my next slide. So they're going to produce lots of products, right? Now, in macro data, that's going to appear as concentration rising because the same products are now produced by a smaller set of firms, right? So you have more concentration, and these firms are also going to charge higher markups on all of their products because they have the same intangible efficiency for all of their goods, right? So you will observe a positive correlation between market share and markups, right? But it's not going to be driven by a Cournot type oligopolistic competition, right? So I'll preserve that correlation, but not the causation. Okay, so as I just alluded to, high intangible firms are going to invest a lot in R&D. Now, this monster here is the first order condition. I'll just give you the intuition. So this is the innovation rate of a firm that produces end products and that has this level of intangible efficiency. The only takeaway from this slide is that high intangible firms invest more in R&D for three reasons. Reason one, they're more likely to be successful. If you're Amazon, you know that you can beat any firm in the economy, so you're happy to invest in R&D because you know that your innovation will be successful. Secondly, if you become the new producer, you're going to be more profitable because you have higher markups. Now, markups partly just offset the higher fixed cost, but overall you're still more profitable, right? So that's reason two. And reason three is that you discount the flow of profits that you get for as long as you produce the good at a lower rate. And that's because if you're a high intangible firm, it's harder for competitors to beat you, and that means that you will produce the good for a longer amount of time before some other producer comes along who takes over. And so for these three reasons, high intangible firms are actually going to be very innovative. So the entry rate, the first order condition looks a lot like this one. It's basically the same, but the only big difference is this term here. So for entrants, they don't know their type yet. They don't know whether they're a high intangible firm or a low intangible firm. They only know how likely it is that they are one of these. Okay, so far the paper is a bit puzzling, right? Because the whole point of this paper was to explain the slowdown of productivity growth. What I've just showed you is that actually high intangible firms, so firms that I'm going to add to this economy, are actually very innovative. They have a high incentive to conduct R&D. So what's going to create a slowdown? Well, if you would just increase the ability to use intangibles of all firms, so if you would homogeneously lower this phi, that would actually raise the level of growth. Why is that? That's because these firms are more profitable, right? Because they have a cost advantage over competitors. And this high profitability induces these firms to want to produce many, many goods. So if all firms become better at using intangibles, you would get higher growth. If conversely, you would do some sort of mean preserving spread, so you would make some firms good in intangibles and some firms bad, that will lower growth. And it will lower growth for two reasons. First, there's going to be a decline in the entry rate. Now, why is that? That's because entrants have some probability of being a high intangible firm, right? Say they have a 5% chance of being the next Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos. But over time in this economy, almost all products end up being produced by high intangible firms because these firms invest so much in research and development. So even though there's a 5% chance that you're the next Jeff Bezos, the incumbent, Amazon, is going to produce almost all goods. So that makes it very expensive to become an entrant. So if there's more inequality in intangible cost, that depresses entry. And second, even though there is a positive effect on investments by high intangible firms, low intangible firms actually have less of an incentive to invest in R&D because they are less likely to succeed and they're more likely to face failing innovation, right? So these firms invest less in research and development, and that's in the end why you get the slowdown of growth. Now, I'm not going to do a mean preserving spread. I'm going to have an experiment where I'm introducing some high intangible firms to the economy, right? So the average level of intangible cost is going to fall in the economy and the variance is going to increase. Right? So ex ante, the effect of that is ambiguous on productivity growth. There's going to be these competing effects working together, where the trade-off is that there's going to be a small group of high intangible firms that invest a lot in R&D, And there's this other group of low intangible firms that are not going to invest. And this is exactly why this paper is able to explain both the slowdown of productivity growth and this increase in R&D investments. And it's because these high intangible firms invest a lot. But remember, the returns to R&D are concave, right? So if a firm spends twice as much in R&D, it doesn't double its growth rate. Right? So if we get some firms that invest a huge amount in R&D and lots of other firms that spend almost nothing on R&D, the average rate of return to R&D is going to fall. And that's why this model can predict both an increase in R&D at the macro level, like you see in the data, as well as a reduction in growth. It's going to appear as if as if R&D has become more costly, but what's happening in practice is there's been a misallocation in research and development. So you can see that quite clearly from this equation. So this is growth, productivity growth in the economy in the steady state. It's equal to the rate. It's basically a weighted average of the rate of creative destruction. So how often a product gets a new producer, multiplied by how much productivity improves when a firm when there's innovation, weighted by the shares of high and low intangible firms among incumbents. So what's going to happen in the model is because these high intangible firms can shake off most of their competitors, the rate of creative destruction is going to fall, and that's going to lead to a slowdown of productivity growth. Time for a pit stop, Ernesto, or is it no questions? Okay, so this is what determines long-term productivity growth. We can also look at productivity in the short run. So this is the expression for output in the model. It's equal to production labor times the CES, the standard CES productivity term, multiplied by some efficiency wedge, because firms have heterogeneous markups, so that lowers TFP a bit, but this turns out to not be quantitatively too important. What's important here is that this is productivity. So in the long run, productivity grows because firms raise Q, right? They're constantly investing in higher quality versions of products, and therefore that raises the level of productivity. But if firms reduce S, if they increase their use of intangibles, that actually has the same effect on productivity. So as firms increase their use of intangibles, right? If initially these high intangible firms enter the economy, initially productivity is going to rise in the economy. So when high intangible firms enter, we're going to get a boom in growth. It's only in the long run, when that depresses the growth rate of Q, that we're going to get a slowdown of productivity growth. And also, and this is, I think, a question that I had at the start, this increase in the use of intangibles is not going to lead to a proportional rise of wages. Why is that? That's because wages in equilibrium are equal to productivity times the average inverse markup. So there's going to be a depression of wages because as firms have higher markups, there's less demand for their products. Less demand for their products means less demand for labor, which means that they can offer a lower wage. Right? And these two offset each other exactly. Right? So when there's an increase in the use of intangibles, there's a rise in markups, there's a rise in productivity, and they exactly offset each other on wages. So what this model is going to predict is that when you have a rise of intangibles in the economy, wages and productivity growth are going to diverge. Wages are going to lag behind productivity growth, and that's exactly what you saw in the US in the 90s. Okay, so I'll be brief on the empirics. So the main thing I show is that is these facts. So if indeed intangible inputs cause an increase in fixed costs, we should see that the ratio of fixed to variable costs is increasing over time, especially when firms use more IT themselves. This is something that is a bit tricky to show in the data because you don't really observe which costs are fixed at the firm level. Right? But what you can look at is how profits are behaving compared to markups. And that's because markups, prices over marginal cost, measure a firm's marginal profits. Whereas profit rates, so say profits divided by revenue, measure average profits. Right? So it accounts for fixed costs. If you see a growing wedge between profits and markups, that's evidence that fixed costs are rising. Right? So to be more precise, this is profits. It's prices minus marginal costs times output minus fixed costs. Right? So as long as marginal costs, and this is going to be the identifying assumption here, as long as marginal costs are constant within a firm year, you can write profits like this. If you then divide both sides by revenue, right, this is output times price. If you divide that by revenue, that's equal to 1. That's here. This is output times marginal cost. If you divide that by output times price, you get marginal cost divided by price. That's just the inverse markup. Right? And then I move profit divided by revenue to the right-hand side, fixed cost divided by revenue to the left-hand side. And what you get is a very simple measure of fixed cost. Right? Fixed cost is some function of markups minus profits over revenue. And the intuition here is very simple. Markups measure marginal profits, profits measure, the profit rate measures average profits, and if the two diverge, that's evidence that fixed costs are rising. Okay, so I measure this for the US and for France. For the US, I use data on listed firms from Compustat. I merge that also with firm level IT data from Hardy Hanks. So I have data on the amount of computers that they have per staff and data on IT budgets. I also have French data. So for France, I have data from 1994 to 2016. It's the full firm census. And I can merge this with data on software investments, research and development, etc., from surveys. So from this, I estimate markups, I look at profits, and I calculate that measure of fixed cost. And what you see in the data is that fixed costs have risen quite a bit. So in France, fixed costs have increased from about 9 to 14%. For the US, they've increased from about 14 to 23%. And so it seems that profits are rising much slower than markups, which I interpret as the rise of fixed costs. Right? It's a model consistent interpretation of that fact. So from the rise of markups, if you read De Looker, Eickhout, Unger in the QGE, you would think markups are exploding. Right? It's a disaster because markups have gone from 20 to 60%. That's you know there's no cause for that much alarm in a sense that markups might have increased a lot, but part of that is actually paying for fixed cost. And if you look at profitability, the increase has actually been quite a bit more modest. If we look at the firm level and we look at correlations, for example, between fixed costs and software spending, you actually get very significant positive correlations there as well, also including firm fixed effects, right? So as a firm invests more in software, its fixed costs over revenue appear to be increasing. Or to just exactly say what they say is this is showing that the difference between your markup and your profitability is rising when you spend more on software, right? And that's exactly what the model predicts.
Martin,
The model also has a
I have a question. You said that it's hard to distinguish between fixed costs and variable costs usually, like even more in Compustat data. So, I mean, don't you think? I mean, I don't know how you measure markups here, because that seems to be key to get the share of fixed costs. Because I think when you measure markups, you also have to take some stand about like what is a variable cost and a fixed cost, right?
No, you don't. So that's actually the beauty. So if you estimate, so I'm estimating markups here with the Looker-Wazinski approach, which comes from Hall 1988. Do I have a slide? I'm actually not sure this backup slide still works. I don't want to click it. But so so the beauty of the Looker-Wazinski approach is that you only need to know that a particular subset of a firm's costs is variable. So you don't need to observe all variable costs. And as long as you have some particular variable cost, you can use the first order condition of cost minimization to back out what the markup is. But so the difference is that if I would directly try to infer marginal cost from the data, variable cost and fixed cost from the data, I would have to know all variable costs. And now I just have to trust a subset. Right? So it's a much lower requirement.
Okay.
Right, so for example, in Compustat you only have broad categories, so you have to make some broad assumptions. I have to make the assumption that cost of goods sold is variable. In the French data, I observe not just materials, but not just for intermediate inputs. I even observe purchase materials. Right, so I can say, well, the amount of merchandise that you buy is a variable cost. Right, so and things like labor, which is such a big chunk of cost, is partly going to reflect spending on intangibles. It's going to partly reflect R&D. That's a whole mess that I don't have to get into there, right? So this is exactly what the beauty of this simple way of getting at fixed cost is.
Okay, great, thank you.
All right. So the model also implies a bunch of other correlations that we can check between the data and the model. So the model implies that firms with higher fixed costs are going to invest more in innovation. What I can do is I can regress R&D on this fixed cost ratio that I just showed. If I do that, I find very significant and large relationships. So these high fixed cost firms indeed invest more in R&D. I show that these high fixed cost firms grow faster as well, and I show that they charge higher markups. Right. So and all of these relationships are model consistent. And in the paper, I also show that the coefficients are roughly comparable. Okay,
Martin,
so the final, yeah, go ahead.
sorry, before you move to the next slide, uh, I'm wondering whether there is any sort of dimension of heterogeneity across industries that you could exploit. So I was thinking about the share of intangible inputs or or maybe something else. Uh,
Yeah,
are you
absolutely.
guys thought about it?
Yeah, I mean, the OECD has done that for me. So Chiara Criscola's team at the OECD actually has basically written that paper. It's called Super Size Me. But they show exactly that the trends in both in markups and in concentration that you see in the data are yeah, the trends that motivate the paper are especially strong in these high intangible industries, right? So in industries where intangibles play more of a role, you see more of these trends that we're worried about, right? So it's not the case that you see the same for haircuts or something, which is comforting, right? Because I mean, yeah, I completely agree that intangibles cannot play the same role everywhere. But so it's yeah, QR codes. So there's two papers. One is Super Size Me, and then the other one I think is called Markups in the Digital Era. But yeah, they've done that.
Martin, one question just in terms of interpretation to be sure I'm understanding. So all the sources of markup in the model are technological in a sense. So it comes from either this lambda jumps or this Sij, which are all technological features. So
Yeah.
is it true that in this context, like, I mean, I saw you had this term about the wedges with the markup, but like, are they inefficient? Will they generate any inefficiency in the model? Like, what are the normative properties of these markups in this
I
model?
mean, in these models, right, like normative stuff is all so messed up because there's so many
Okay,
externalities at the same time.
I see.
So like a first best is that we're way beyond first best. Like I mean, we're never gonna get there because there's also the whole innovation side, right, where there's
Right, right,
big
right. The
big
externalities of innovation.
inefficiencies.
Yeah.
Exactly. Now, I mean, what is important to
I
keep in
mean,
mind is
sorry. So where I'm coming from is the following. So you have all this discussion about there's a bunch of people arguing that I mean, kind of underlying the literature on the markup estimation, sort of this idea that the rise in markup is something bad. And then there are a couple of papers that argue, you know, maybe this is not necessarily bad because it's sort of showing underlying technological forces that not necessarily imply that, you know, it's bad for misallocation or productivity or whatever. So I wanted to see a sense of, you know, how much the model would kind of inform that debate about how bad this rise in markup is.
so the model says that the model says that the rise of markups is a consequence of something that is actually bad. And I do a welfare analysis in the paper, so I actually quantify the
Okay.
welfare loss. It is ambiguous, right? So if you have a broad-based rise of intangibles, it would raise growth. It's good for welfare. But in the calibration that I run, and I'll show you in a second exactly what that is, it's going to be a reduction in welfare. It's mainly going to work through the slowdown of growth, right? So the markups are a reflection of this technology changing the way that firms produce and compete. That's going to affect the ability of firms to enter new markets and to innovate, and that in terms is bad. Right? But it's not super intuitive in that it's a model where I'm going to introduce a group of high productivity firms, and it's going to lower productivity growth. Right? We're going to
Okay.
increase. We're going to shift out the production possibility frontier statically, yet there's going to be a reduction in welfare. And it's all going to work to this dynamic externality that these firms have, which is they keep other firms out of the market.
Yeah, got
Okay?
it. Thanks.
So to quantify the model, initially I just assumed that all firms are equally good at intangibles. So everyone has the same phi. I'm going to structurally estimate the model to match moments from the early 1980s for the US. And then the experiment that I'm going to put is I'm going to assign a lower intangible cost parameter to a fraction of entrance. So that means that for the experiment, I need to calibrate two things. I need to assign a level of this intangible efficiency. So how good are the high intangible firms? And I have to choose how broad-based the rise is. So what I'm going to target is the increase. This is non-R&D intangible investments, but I've actually just changed it. I'm going to target the increase in fixed cost because my referees asked me for this. I'm going to target the rise in fixed cost. It's going to be the moment for how good high intangible firms are in using intangibles. And then I target the entry rate to get at the fraction of entrance that has the low intangible efficiency. And the idea here is that if you're a firm that has low intangible, if the fraction of entrance that gets this low intangible cost is smaller, it means that the wedge between the probability that you're a high intangible firm and the distribution of intangibles among incumbents is larger because eventually these firms just produce everything, right? So that's why this is the moment. So what I get if I do this is that 10% of entrants is born with 35% lower intangible costs, right? So you don't even need that Amazon is dramatically better at using intangibles than everyone else. At 35% is going to do it. So if I compare the study.
Sorry for interrupting again. So what's I can see that you would need something like this to kind of get at some of the things that you want, but like what's the story? Why is it the case that this opportunities were not taken by other firms?
So the idea here,
I understand the logic of the shock, but like what's the story of why this would be something exogenous, you know?
Right. You mean the shock or just the fight?
The shock.
So the idea is that this is the 1980s. The internet is invented. People start building computer in their garages, and suddenly this feature of the world becomes relevant. Right? So you might say, well, either there were some entrepreneurs that grew up with computers that didn't before, or if you want this, and I actually do both in the paper, you can also say this is a salient feature of firms, but the technology just didn't exist yet. Right? So some firms were always going to be good at IT, and now they suddenly it's possible to use IT, and suddenly the salient difference becomes relevant. Right? Both are fine. The steady state implications of the two are identical, but they're going to have slightly different transitional dynamics, and I show both in the paper, but they're not super different. So one is just a slightly faster transition than the other. Okay, so this is the model's predictions. The arrows here show that everything works in the right direction, but the model also performs quite well quantitatively. So if we compare the economy before the rise of intangibles and the economy after the rise of intangibles, there is a 0.4 percentage point slowdown in total factor productivity in the new steady state compared to 0.9% in the data. R&D over GDP rises by 40% compared to 65% in the data. Entry is targeted, right? So I explained that completely. There is a larger decline in reallocation than in the data. That's because in the model, all growth works through creative destruction. So there is naturally more churn than in the data. I explained about 2/3 of the rise in average markups, as well as most of the rise in fixed costs. But that's all the static difference. The more interesting one is the transitional effect of this rise of intangibles. Right. So what I'm plotting here over time is the path of productivity growth, where the black line is the initial level of productivity, and the red line is the final level of productivity growth. And what you see is that there is initially a boom when high intangible firms enter the market. And that boom is driven by the fact that these firms now are able to produce goods at lower marginal cost than previous firms, right? So there's an initial boom in productivity. These firms then start to invest a lot in research and development, right? So that leads to a further boom in growth. But then over time, these firms are starting to dominate, right? So these firms over time are starting to produce the majority of goods in the economy. It's going to gradually reduce the rate of entry, and therefore it's going to keep productivity from growing at its original rate. And so after about 25 years, productivity is below the old steady state, and the initial peak lasts about 6 or 7 years. Right? By the way, all of this is untargeted, right? So in the data, this rise was about 2%. Here it's 1.85. in the data. This also lasted about 6 years. There's nothing in the model that pins down timing. This is not a model where every year I feed something in to match this. I'm just saying I'm going to have this shock in the model, and then over time, I'm going to have this play out. So it's pure luck that this turns out to be a reasonable timeline, right? It just turns out that this kind of model has realistic transitional dynamic durations.
Sorry, and you say that the data performs in a similar. What's data and what's model here, or is it all model?
This is all model. Yeah, this is all
And
model.
what about,
yeah, exactly.
and the data, you see a similar boom of intangibles?
So in the data, you see exactly. You see, yeah, I should have. So this is part of the 1.5 hour slide version. There, I have the one against the data. But basically, so if you smooth productivity enough, it looks like this. But productivity is, the actual growth rate is super volatile, right? But if you plot it against the HP filtered productivity growth rate, it looks similar. So a similar increase that is of similar length and magnitude, and it's completely untargeted. Okay, so you also see a gradual rise of markups, and you see that productivity, right, has an initial booming growth and wages lag behind, right? And that's because as high intangible firms enter the market, they produce at lower marginal cost. They can use that to extract a higher markup, and that has a depressing effect on wages. Just finally, a little bit of normative analysis. So this is present in much more detail in the paper. Key thing though is that the paper matches that in the data we see a lower research, we see lower productivity growth, but higher research and development. There were 2 reasons for that in the model. The first is that some innovation in the model goes to waste. That's because high intangible firms are able to undercut these inefficient firms on price, and therefore prevent their patents from making it to the market. And so that's one channel. The other is misallocation. So in this model, the private incentives to R&D are really strong for high intangible firms because these firms are very profitable. These firms invest a lot, other firms invest little. If you have concave rates of return to R&D, that suppresses the average rate of return. Right, so this misallocation is the second thing. So if you're interested in this, please have a look at the paper because I have 3 more minutes till I'm out of time. But there I show this for entrants for different calibrations as well. So there's various experiments. Okay, so to finalize, aim of the paper was to explain these 3 macro trends, right? Low productivity growth, lack of dynamism, rise of market power. Explanation is that intangible inputs change the cost structure of firms toward a lower marginal cost but higher fixed cost, and that firms differ in how efficiently they use these inputs. The paper has a lot more, right? So the micro evidence is more elaborate. I discussed the welfare effects more jointly. But the punchline of the paper is that the rise of intangible inputs is bad for growth, causes a decline in dynamism, and a rise of market power, as long as the rise of intangible inputs is not sufficiently inclusive. Right? So if all firms get access to this technology, it will foster growth, it will foster welfare, and that's, I think, a great avenue for future work and policy.
Thank you so much, Martin. Any question or comment?
I have one. I mean, so basically, like you have that intangible. I mean, I was thinking about like social networks, basically, like in IT or IT in general, and that basically there is some sort of like feedback loop from that works through demand. Also, I mean, my point is that like the result that you have in the paper, like buying intangibles, you have like this reduction in marginal cost, but you could also have some sort of effect on demand, right? Like basically, like you could have like a higher perceived quality due to this higher investment in intangibles, and you could create something similar, just that you don't have like this diffusion for the rest of the firms, basically. Is that right? I mean, like basically, or
Yeah, you're completely right. So in these kind of models, quality and productivity are basically isomorphic, right?
Right,
So if you want to flip the labels, that's completely fine. Right, the point is that one of these inputs here, and that's what breaks the isomorphism in this model, one of the inputs has the positive externality of raising the quality ladder and the other doesn't. right? And so I label that quality versus productivity. But if you want to flip the labels, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, right? And probably reality is a bit of both. But what is key here is that the intangible technology does not enable standing on shoulders.
Yeah. Sorry, one more follow-up question, and I finish. The other is that, I mean, intangibles are some sort of like, I mean, you could also think about them as an input, and there could also be like innovation on intangibles later. I mean, one would imagine that, like in the very long run, like if it is so profitable to invest in intangibles, like the price of these intangibles would go up, and basically there would be R&D in these intangibles, and costs would be lower for the other firms too, right? This is like
Yeah, and I think the good news here is that exactly what we've seen in the last 10 years is a shift from firms developing their own software to firms just purchasing that off the market. And so
right.
the whole rise of software as a service, I think, is really potentially beneficial in that it offers the high five firms, right, so the firms that are bad at IT, to purchase their intangibles from someone else.
Yeah.
Now, the question is, of course, at what price? Because what the model relies on is that for firms that are bad at IT, it costs more to achieve the same cost reduction.
Yeah,
Right, so if they can now purchase their IT from Amazon, but Amazon charges a very high price,
of course.
that's de facto the same as the model. But as that market becomes more competitive, the model predicts that is good for welfare and good for growth.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So Martin, following up on that, so I guess the model would imply that as this access to these services increases, we would see a rise in productivity and sort of a stop in the rise in markups and so on in the sort of last decade or last 5 years or so. Do you see that in the data as well? Is that something? I mean, what will be missing to kind of get at those recent developments?
I think if you look at the data, to me, it looks more like we're arriving at steady state, right? So if you look at the data, I think that the rise of markups is flattened out, but obviously once this technology becomes really inclusive, you should actually see a slight decline in sorry, not in markups. No, sorry, markups should be flat, but you should see productivity pick up again. I mean that you don't see, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Okay. So
productivity
that's the puzzle, I guess. That productivity hasn't
yeah.
picked up.
Maybe there's a lag. Maybe talk to me in 5 years.
We have to wait. We have to wait.
Exactly,
Okay.
exactly. But so for markups, yeah, but for markups, of course, markups keep rising, right? So the more inclusive the technology, markups will just increase because markups hinge on the fact that the only firm that uses the technology is the producer, right? So even if the technology is more inclusive, that makes the innovation game more equitable, right? So it raises growth, but you still get that firms can use this technology to charge a higher markup. So the markup would stay elevated.
Because I had a different. I mean, you focused a lot on like softwares, but there's another version, a type of like intangible capital that other researchers have sort of highlighted, which has to do with like the value of the brand and has to do with advertisement and marketing and so on. And there's an old paper that kind of argued that this was kind of a big deal in terms of explaining rising concentration, not markups, I think, but rising concentration. And the idea there is that if you can build a sufficiently large customer base that is sort of isolated from competition because of marketing and advertisement, then that's gonna even their followers that could catch up, they will never catch up to the sort of the brand value that these leaders generate, and therefore sort of you can keep a sustainable sort of growth model in which it's balanced and you have like an equilibrium with sort of this stays as it is. But it has nothing to. I guess the idea there is that it's more related to this marketing and advertisement rather than software itself.
Yeah, I mean, in general, the mechanisms in the paper will go through whenever you have an input that has this fixed versus marginal cost structure and that some firms use more efficiently than others. I think what is slightly different about what I'm describing and what you're describing is static efficiency. So in my model, the firm that produces statically is actually the one that you want to produce. Is the firm that for the lowest inputs can offer the greatest return to consumers. All of the negative effects are actually dynamic, right? Whereas I think if consumers are tricked into using the wrong product or something, it's the static efficiency argument is no longer there. But yeah, I mean, I agree that advertising is interesting, and there's these guys who are Power Roldan at your colleagues at the Bank of Spain, and what's his? There's a guy in Toronto. Forgot his name, but yeah, they're writing up really interesting growth models where there is a role for advertising, which can either which actually is bad for growth because it actually can look so good for consumers, but doesn't enable standing on shoulders.